I'm feeling very old. Last Friday I turned 50, but that didn't convince me that I was old. It was that on Saturday I received my AARP card in the mail. But consistent with feeling old, I'm feeling very old about the debate that I want to reprise here tonight, a debate that many of us in this room have been engaged in for an extremely long time, a debate about the character and future of copyright. And in my view, it is an unnecessary fight. That there is a way of understanding a future for copyright that everyone in this room, as well as my friends who wouldn't be invited to this room, should be able to agree about. And that what's necessary now is a certain leadership from both sides of this aisle to identify principles and a direction that could begin to frame a debate for copyright in the 21st century. And so my objective tonight is to try to open up that discussion. And I want to start by setting next to each other two stories. One I've recurred to many times in talks, but it is a theme of how I understand the particular dynamic and problem of copyright as it has evolved in the 21st century. So let me start with that. It starts with my hero, John Philip Sousa, who in 1906 traveled here to the United States Capitol to talk about this technology, what Sousa referred to as the, quote, talking machines. John Philip Sousa was not a fan of the talking machines. This is what he had to say. He said, "These talking machines are going to ruin the artistic development of music in this country. When I was a boy, in front of every house in the summer evenings, you would find young people together singing the songs of the day or the old songs. Today you hear these infernal machines going night and day. We will not have a vocal cord left," Sousa said. "The vocal cords will be eliminated by a process of evolution, as was the tale of man when he came from the ape." Now, this is the picture I want you to focus on here. Picture of young people getting together, singing the songs of the day or the old songs. This is a picture of culture. We could call it, using modern computer terminology, a kind of read-write culture. It's a culture where people participate in the creation and recreation of their culture. In that sense, it's read-write. And Sousa's fear, this copyright protecting author's fear, was that our society would lose the capacity to engage in this read-write creativity because of these, quote, infernal machines. They would take it away, displace it, and in its place, we'd have the opposite of read-write creativity, what you could call, using modern computer terminology, a kind of read-only culture. A culture where creativity is consumed, but the consumer is not a creator. A culture in this sense that's top-down, where the vocal cords of the millions of ordinary people have been lost. Now, if you look back at the 20th century, at least in what we call the developed world, it's pretty hard not to conclude that John Philip Sousa was right. Never before in the history of human culture had its production become as concentrated. Never before had it become as professionalized. Never before had the creativity of ordinary people been as effectively displaced, and displaced because of these infernal machines. A technology like these technologies produced a certain kind of culture. A culture, to invoke fair use, Michael Donaldson will back me up on this, like this. It enabled efficient consumption of culture, what I call reading, but inefficient amateur production, what I want to call writing. It's a good culture for listening, not a great culture for amateur speaking, a good culture for watching, not a great culture for creating. The 20th century was unique in the history of human culture in being the first which dominates in this read-only mode of cultural creativity and spread. That's the first story. Here's the second. So when I grew up, this is what I thought the Brat Pack was. this fantastic film by John Hughes, 1985, The Breakfast Club, stands next to another piece of work, which I hope many of you know something about, the song Listomania by Phoenix. This was the music video which was released when this song came out. Someone had the idea, what would happen if we mix these two works together, Breakfast Club and Listomania? And they created this video. On YouTube, and people began to get the idea, what if we make our own version of this video? So there was a Brooklyn version. A San Francisco version. So sentimental, not sentimental, no. To highlight my current location, a Boston University version. Of these across the net from every part of the world, people replicating and remaking this version of music. The obvious point I want you to draw from this is that Sousa would smile at this story. This is the young people getting together, singing the songs of the day or the old songs. But what they do now is they get together not on the corner streets or in the backyards. They get together using a digital platform and free infrastructure for sharing their creativity and creating and sharing in this amateur way across the world. It is a technology, not a technology like these, but instead a technology comprised of this mix of technologies that has produced a certain kind of culture, the culture that gets expressed in this type of video or any number of others that we could have pointed to here. Enabling efficient consumption, we could say reading, but also efficient amateur production, what we could call writing. Listening and speaking, watching and creating, marking the 21st century as perhaps the first in a return to a mix, at least, between read-only and read-write culture. Okay, those are the two stories I want to introduce this argument about how I think we need to think about copyright in this age. So inspired by my colleague James Boyle, I'm going to start by suggesting we should recognize the way creativity happens within an ecology. An ecology, by which I mean an environment which sets the conditions of exchange. But these ecologies for creativity are different. Different in the sense that some of them require money at the core, others don't require money at the core. And some of them both have money and don't depend upon money at the core of their creativity. These ecologies are different. So think about the professional ecology of creativity, the ecology that produced this great work or work by this great artist or John Philip Sousa himself. For these cultures of creativity, for these ecologies of creativity, control is important. Control is important to assure the compensation that the artists need for the purpose of creating the incentives to create great work, compensation in the form of money. This is an essential part of the professional culture. Professional culture depends upon, therefore, copyright at its core to assure that control, to make sure the rewards are sufficient to induce the creativity we require. But amateur culture is different. Now, by amateur, I don't mean amateurish, though some might think it is. I mean instead people who are creating not for the money, but for the love of their work, the kind of creators which I demonstrated performing the Listomania song. So people who create not for the money here. Right? So, for example, think about kids playing music, think about much of the stuff on YouTube, think about what Sousa was romanticizing. The point is, this ecology does not depend upon copyright. This ecology instead depends upon the ability to freely use and remix culture that's been produced elsewhere. To create within this culture often happens in what we could think of as a sharing economy. So a sharing economy, the kind of economy that exists between friends like this, or between lovers. For these kinds of economies, money is just not how we speak. It's not how we interact. Indeed, if we introduce money into that kind of economy, we radically change the character of that economy. So imagine one friend says to the other, you want to get together next week? The first one says, well, sure, for 50 bucks. Or if you dropped money into this relationship, it radically changes the character of that relationship, right? So the point is, these cultures depend upon money not being at the center of their ecology of creativity. Instead, they depend upon a kind of use that is reciprocal and respectful, but not defined by that market. And then we can think about one final ecology. Think about science or the academy, which produces and depends upon cultural production for its work. Here's a very old representation of it, but I want you to focus carefully on this. This is actually an early pirate here, because notice what he's doing here. He's copying literally from the text that he is studying, right? This too creates, but this creates in a mixed ecology. The creators here, like professors, produce things for free, but also get paid to produce it. They produce it in part for the love. The love is more than they typically are paid, but that defines the character of this ecology. It depends upon both free and fair use. Now, the key to this point is that these ecologies here coexist. There's not one that is to dominate all others. They complement each other. And the copyright system must support each of them. It must support the professional through the incentives the professional needs to create the kind of culture professionals create, but it must also support the amateur and scientific ecologies through the freedoms that they depend upon. Again, this is a central point to what I want to argue tonight. I'm going to emphasize it one more time. The copyright system we are creating now has to think about two things, not one. Historically, it thought about one, which was how to protect the professional. It didn't have to worry about the amateur or the scientific space. But for the reasons I'm going to describe, it now needs to worry about all three, and it needs to be architected to assure that it achieves the kind of cultural production in all three at least. It needs to provide the incentives here while protecting the freedoms that are necessary here. Okay, so these ecologies change. Technologies change them. Broadcasting changed the production ecology of culture to something like this. Governments change them. Chinese government fighting Tibetan music to radically change the way Tibet understands its own musical traditions. Economics changed them. 18th century opera was king and musicians were troubadours. In the 20th century, it's the musician who is king and opera which has collapsed because of the economics of these forms of production. These ecologies change, and the radical point that brings us to the debate we're talking about tonight is that the internet has changed them too. It's changed the professional ecology, sites like Napster and then the modern version in a legitimized form, Apple iTunes, producing radical new markets, radical increase in diversity of culture that people are able to buy and consume anytime, anywhere. It's changed scientific ecology of creation. So archive.org was the first and is still in physics the most important site for locating and archiving journal articles in the context of physics, which are freely available and universally relied upon as opposed to print journals. Public Library of Science, which has launched a massive project to facilitate freely licensed scientific journals in a wide range of scientific disciplines. Blogs, all of these are radical new opportunities to spread ideas broadly, facilitated by this radical change in technology. And the amateur culture, again, is the culture I pointed to with YouTube as a radical change in the opportunity to produce and share a culture because of this technology. So the internet has changed each of these ecologies, and the question we lawyers must confront is this. As the internet has changed these ecologies, has copyright kept up with the change? Has it succeeded in providing the incentives it needs to the professional, given these changes, and succeeded in assuring the freedoms it needs to the amateur and scientific, given these changes? My view, not surprising, is that the answer to that question is simple and binary. No. Copyright law has not kept up. It has failed. It has failed to assure the incentives that professionals need by failing to adequately and properly deal with problems that are persistent for the professional, including the problems of, quote, piracy. And it has failed to properly protect the freedoms that are necessary here. It's failed in both of these spaces. And in my view, it's not an accident that the copyright law that we inherited has failed. It is an implication of two features, or bugs, of copyright law that we have inherited. Number one, it is a feature of the narrow focus of copyright. It's focused on exclusively the professional ecology of creativity. And number two, it's a feature of the architecture of the law of copyright. The architecture, in the sense of a law which gets triggered on the production of a copy in an analog world is harmless, in a digital world is senseless, because such a law regulates way too much and regulates way too poorly. So think, for example, about a book in physical space. If these are conceptually all the uses of a book in physical space, an important set of these uses were technically unregulated by the law. So to read a book is not a fair use of the book, it's a free use of the book, because to read a book is not to produce a copy. To give a book is not a fair use, it's a free use, because to give a book is not to produce a copy. To sell a book, explicitly exempted from further regulation and copyright law, to sell a book is not to produce a copy. In no jurisdiction is sleeping on a book a regulation regulated by copyright law, not triggering copyright law anywhere. These unregulated uses were then balanced by a set of core regulated uses, regulated to create the incentives that artists need to create great new works. And in the American tradition, we have a thin sliver of exceptions called fair uses. Some of us think it's fatter than other of us, perhaps, but fair uses, uses which otherwise would have been regulated by the law, but which the law sets free because it's important for commentary or subsequent production. Okay, unregulated, regulated, and fair uses enter the net where every single use produces a copy. This balance gets transformed merely because the platform through which we get access to our culture has changed. And this produces a problem. The problem is not us, by which I mean the people you think I represent, or your kids who are violating copyright law much more than I do, I promise you. The problem is not that community. The problem is this design of copyright law. And 15 years into this, quote, war, the copyright wars, what my friend, the late Jack Valenti, used to refer to as his own, quote, terrorist war, where apparently the terrorists in this war are our children. 15 years into this terrorist war, it is time for us to recognize this failing of the architecture of copyright law and fix it. Okay, so that's the argument. Here's the suggestion. How would we do that? I think we need to think, we, in this union of interests here, need to think about both short-term and long-term changes. And in the short term, we need to move to change this system through encouraging a voluntary licensing that demonstrates a better balance for creativity in this digital era. That was the objective of the project that I launched with colleagues at Stanford called the Creative Commons Project. And I'm very happy to be able to have with me tonight Christian Henkel von Donnersmarck, who was one of our founding directors in the context of internationalizing this project. Creative Commons' objective was to find a simple way for authors and creators to mark their content with the freedoms that they intended it to carry. So rather than an all rights reserved default, this was a some rights reserved default, where some rights were reserved and others were clearly marked as handed over to the public. So this license would come through answering simple questions about whether you want to allow commercial use, whether you want to allow modifications, and if you do allow modifications, whether you want to require the modification be freely licensed as well. The answers to those questions would then give you a license. The license would come in 3 layers. There's a human-readable commons deed intended to be understandable by ordinary people that would express the terms that apply to this particular bit of content. Then very different, there's a lawyer-readable license, a billion-page document written by the best lawyers we could find that makes enforceable the freedoms associated with this content. And then critically, there's a machine-readable expression of the freedoms associated with the content so that search engines like first Yahoo and now Google and Bing have made it possible to gather content on the basis of these freedoms. This project was launched in December of 2002. When we launched it, we had an extraordinary pairing of videos. Not so surprising, we had a video by John Perry Barlow.
I'm John Perry Barlow, and I'm really sorry I am not there with you tonight. I think this is an enormously important occasion, and I think what you're creating here is an enormously important organization. I think that implicit in freedom of speech is the right to know, and the right...
I'm glad to be here via this video. I wished I could be there in person. But I wanted to say just a few words about Larry Lessig's concept of Creative Commons. I'm attracted to it for the following reasons. First, Larry makes it clear that he is respectful of and supports copyrighted material that artists create, and he believes it ought to be protected. But he also says, and I agree, that there are those people who have copyrighted material who may want to give up part of their copyright, or all of it, to put on the Creative Commons and let other people view it or hear it or whatever. And I have no problem with that. I think that's part of the free society in this country, that if you want other people to have your material that you have created free of charge, with your permission, wonderful. And I find that to be a salutary kind of thing. But I think it's also important, as Larry staunchly believes, that those people who have copyrighted material, whether it be a book or a television program or home video or music or movie or computer software, and who want it protected so that they can make sure that it can move through the various venues where that material is brought to the public and given to consumers at fair and reasonable prices. So I think what Larry has come up with is a marvelous balance between the protection of copyright material and the dissemination of material that copyright owners want made available to others without any charge at all. So I thank you, Larry, for bringing this concept to life, and I think it's something that is useful and worthy, and which is why I support this, what I call the Lessig Compact, the Creative Commons. So thank you for letting me say a few words, and I hope, Larry, the fact that I'm supporting you in this doesn't ruin your reputation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was really hurt by that support, terribly. I was really honored, of course. And this movement then started by spreading this project around the world to other jurisdictions that ported the licenses into their own national law. And today we have more than 100 partner institutions around the world that are porting and deploying Creative Commons licenses consistent with local law, but maintaining the standards so that across jurisdictions the same freedoms apply to the content that gets licensed. When we launched this in 2002, after a year we could record about 1 million objects that were licensed under the licenses. Now there are more than 500 million that we can track that have been licensed under these licenses on the web, all of them referring back to this core set of licenses that define the 6 licenses of Creative Commons. Now, these licenses, these copyright licenses, support these different ecologies differently. So the simplest license, a license that says, I waive all rights except you must give me attribution, supports each of them directly, supports professional creators, supports amateur creators, supports scientists, and different institutions deploy it. So the White House deploys this on their site. Public Library of Science uses it for all journal articles that they publish. Al Jazeera makes an extraordinary amount of video available from the Middle East available under this license. And now YouTube has announced just last week that they have made it possible inside their video editor to mark videos with Creative Commons licenses and to pull in CC licensed videos from their video editor. And they will continue to extract the sources that get pulled in as CC licensed sources and make it simple to search and identify content on the basis of whether it is CC licensed. So that's the freest and the broadest application of this content, and it was supported by the donation. Now it's up to 60,000 videos from sites such as C-SPAN and Al Jazeera and other sites that have important video they want to make available according to this set of freedoms. Then there's a hybrid attribution non-commercial, which basically says you can use this work for non-commercial purposes, but we've added a plus component here to make it simple to go back and license the work for commercial purposes if in fact that's what you want to do, so that non-commercial users don't have any barrier to using the work, but commercial users can clear the rights in the traditional way. And Flickr was one of the first sites to deploy this. Flickr has long used Creative Commons licenses, and recently in a partnership with Getty has allowed it so that Creative Commons licenses can be partnered with Getty licensed for commercial purposes, so that this picture, for example, can be CC licensed for non-commercial purposes, but there's a simple click-through to buy commercial rights necessary for that image. And then traditional in the computer science field and the free software field is something we call the attribution share-alike. Copyright geeks will refer to it as the copyleft license that we have. This is a license that requires that any derivative be licensed under the same license. So you can copy it and do with it what you want. You can use it for commercial purposes, but any derivative must be freely licensed. And that supports professional and amateur culture, and Wikipedia is our most proud deployer of this license to guarantee that any modification of Wikipedia will be licensed freely like everything before, but anybody's free to commercially deploy this however they'd like. Now, the primary intent that we had in starting this project was to support these 2 ecologies, but it's not the exclusive intent. There's been a wide range of artists who have deployed Creative Commons licenses for their commercial objectives because they see it as a way to build loyalty with their audience. But most surprising, something we didn't even think about, is the significant effect of the way that it's built copyright understanding in our community. Christiana was with me when we launched Creative Commons licenses in China. The China Daily, when we launched Creative Commons licenses, had this front page story about how CC licenses were going to enable better protection of intellectual property in China. And the argument was that this more balanced system of copyright protection was going to earn more respect from the people in China and therefore earn a higher chance that they would be willing to respect the rights claimed over more extreme copyright licenses. And this type of balance builds a certain kind of alliance with people traditionally not identified with copyright interests and those that are. So this is a photograph taken by a photographer, Mary Cloud Montano. She posted it on Flickr, and she posted it under a license that allowed non-commercial use for free, no derivatives either, under Creative Commons license. This newspaper took it and used it without her permission. That induced a kind of virtual riot on the internet, as people were furious at the fact that her rights had been violated. As this Global Voices article describes it, bloggers from Colombia gathered to punish the newspaper for their violation of her copyrights, and eventually the newspaper backed down and paid her the compensation she was entitled because of their violation of the rights expressed in the license. Here's another example. Alan Sandquist posted this image in Flickr under a non-commercial license. Auto Week took it and made a very slight change to it, hoping nobody would notice. Somebody did notice. There once again was this kind of riot. And these CC activists, people who were pushing the Creative Commons movement, quickly became copyright activists as they defended the artist's right here and described what Auto Week had done as, quote, piracy. So that the movements that start in these radically separate places become aligned as they express a common interest that the artist gets to control how the artist's work gets deployed. Now, my view is Creative Commons is an important start here. It's not enough to fixing the questions of copyright's problems in the 21st century. We need more changes in practices. And the one that I think is easy, low-hanging fruit that all of us should agree about is that we need to enable better legal reuse of creative work. So think about your kids as they use Google and Bing to gather material to do school assignments, for example, where they're told to do some project explaining the history of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And in this age of remix, where writing is remixed, they're told to gather images and music and text and put it together in some particular project. Think about how difficult it is for the kids to do this legally, to do it in a way that complies with the rights claimed by the rights holders. So for example, if you go to Google and you search on their image page, you're given all these extraordinary choices, a large image, an icon image, a face image. You can pick the color of the image you're going to see. But why in this range of options aren't you also given a simple reuse option where you can filter the images on the basis of whether the author has authorized reuse according to some free license like a Creative Commons license? So this is a practice that right now these companies could deploy to make it easier for people to comply with the law and therefore encourage them to comply with the law and respect the underlying rights that these licenses are built upon. But in addition to these changes in practices, we need changes in law. And that's the longer term project that I want to finish up by describing. In my view, we need a copyright institution. My view is WIPO should be that institution, to begin to lead something like a Blue Skies Commission that begins to think about 10 years from now, not next year, 10 years, 15 years from now, what architecture for copyright makes sense in the digital age. We need it far enough ahead so that when people participate, they're participating thinking about the nature of the problem and not the nature of their client's interests tomorrow. But they can build upon the experience and insight that comes from a diversity of people, especially people in the business of enforcing and protecting copyright now. And as I thought through this Blue Sky Commission's product, I think that there are 6 elements to what this system of copyright has got to have. 6 markers that distinguish it from the system we inherit from the 20th century. Number 1, it needs to be simple. It was a great system of copyright that required very well-educated lawyers to learn very complicated doctrine and charge very high fees to advise their clients when the only people who needed to worry about copyright were very wealthy clients who could afford the high fees that we charged as we did our complex work in copyright law. But if copyright law is intended now to regulate 15-year-olds, 15-year-olds need to understand it. They need to be able to understand its contours and what it means, and they don't. Indeed, most of us don't. And so we need to remake this law to make it simple first and understandable and transparent to those whom we want to regulate. Number 2, we need to make it efficient. Copyright is, of course, a property system, but it is also the most inefficient property system known to man. We have built the system now so that we can't even know who owns what. And the only remedy to that core failing of this property system is to return to an architecture that insists upon certain formalities, a position which another non-ally of mine typically is an ally with me on the RIAA has now taken a strong stand supporting. Not necessarily formalities on creation, which of course was the traditional American way to deal with formalities, but at least formalities to maintain the quality of the right over time, so that a copyright owner, after a number of years, 5 years, needs to take affirmative steps to register and protect the work so that we have a simple way of identifying who owns what. Number three, the rights and the public domain needs to be reliable. The public domain needs to be clear and stable, so that when we tell people to build upon the public domain, to create derivatives out of the public domain, like Disney did to their great credit, there is no danger that that public domain then gets restored out from under them, so that opportunity for restoring can undermine the incentives people have to build on the public domain. Now, this sounds like, to many, I'm sure, an esoteric problem, except, of course, the Supreme Court has granted cert in a case that will address this question directly in the fall, Golan versus Holder, which considers a statute, the URAA, Uruguay Agreement Act, that explicitly restored the copyrights to a number of works that had lost their copyright and protected by foreign authors for the first time, the argument is, in American history, restoring works to copyright. And if this were generally permitted, then we can see anytime Congress has an important government interest, like dealing with the deficit, the government would be in the position to auction off the public domain to the highest bidder so that they can deal with this important interest of the deficit. So that needs to be addressed through a clear rule that says the public domain remains the public domain. It cannot be recaptured even by Congress. Number four, these rules have to be targeted. They have to regulate selectively. They have to regulate where they're necessary to do good. So I can't help it, I'm a professor, so I need to build a matrix here for a second. So think for a second about distinction between remix and copies, and a distinction between the professional and the amateur. We get this 2x2 matrix. Copyright law now looks at this all basically the same. But if we think about these four boxes, it's clear that copyright law needs to function efficiently and effectively, protecting the professional in any context where copies of the professional's work is being distributed, especially without the professional's permission. So that seems to me to be the core and most important area for the system to work efficiently. But this box, amateurs engaging in remix of creative work, needs to be free of copyrights regulation. Not fair use, not the use that requires the advice of highly skilled attorneys, but free use that defines it as set off from the regulation of copyright so that kids and others who would engage in this kind of creativity don't need to worry about the law as it applies there. And then in these middle cases, there's a more mixed balance necessary. So of course, an amateur sharing the latest Madonna CD with his 50,000 best friends is obviously a problem from the perspective of copyright law. It needs to be regulated by copyright law, even if it's not for money. And professionals remixing in the context of taking a novel and turning it into a film is a traditional area of copyright that, in my view, continues to need to be regulated by the rules of copyright, even if there are forms of remix creativity, like the work of certain graphic artists or the work of musicians like Girl Talk, that should be set off from the traditional protection of copyright. But that balance expresses a desire to deregulate a significant chunk of the culture space, a significant space of culture, and to focus the regulation where it can do some good. Number five, the system must be effective. It must actually work for its purpose, which is to get artists paid. But the current system that we have doesn't actually do that well because of the architecture as it implicates the way music in particular gets distributed. And the objective of any change must focus on the artist as the primary beneficiary of this change. And number six, finally, it needs to be realistic. And here's where we return to this question of peer-to-peer piracy internationally and the way copyright law needs to think about dealing with it. So we're at least a decade into this war. A war which, in my view, is a total failure from the objective of eliminating or reducing peer-to-peer piracy. Now, it's the response of some to failed wars, we could say us in particular, to continue to wage an ever more effective war, more vicious war against the enemy, and to think about provisions like 3 strikes and you're off the internet as a way to deal with these questions of, quote, piracy. But my suggestion is we adopt the opposite strategy to deal with failed wars. We embrace peace as the objective here, and we think about proposals that could achieve the objective of the war without its unwinnable costs. So proposals like the compulsory licenses, the voluntary collective licenses, or the Green Party's cultural flat rate as proposed in Germany, all of these are ways to recognize the objective of copyright to compensate artists without radically weakening the architecture of the net to facilitate its objectives as a medium for sharing. Now, the thing to think about when you think about these proposals is, if we had had these proposals a decade ago implemented in law, how would the world be different? Well, number one, artists would have more money, because of course, artists got nothing from the decade of file sharing and piracy that we have just seen. Businesses would have had more competition. It wouldn't just have been the one or two extremely brave and sometimes stupid businesses that stepped out and tried to innovate in this space. Rules would have been clearer. We would have had more who would have been willing to find ways to figure out how to facilitate this system working. But from my perspective, as the father of 3 young children, the most important difference is we would not have generated a generation of criminals. We would not have produced a generation of kids who think because we tell them they are pirates because that's in fact what their behavior entails. Now, the objective of this Blue Sky Commission, whether 5 years or more, would begin then to think about mapping what we could describe as Burn 2, that understands how the objectives of copyright can be achieved in a digital environment and seeks to achieve those objectives, recognizing the potentials and limits of the environment, as to find this system here that could work. Now, let me just end with one more reflection, particularly focused on we lawyers. So I was invited to speak at this place. This is the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. In an event that was to talk about fair use. And the event was held in this room, very beautiful facility with these velvet curtains and red carpet. And the event was packed. There's a whole bunch of people speaking, but packed with artists and creators and some lawyers, all of whom were very eager to understand how it was they could create consistent with the law of fair use. So the organizers said, well, fair use, of course, has 4 factors. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask 4 lawyers to spend 15 minutes describing each of the 4 factors on the theory that in 60 minutes, the whole audience would understand the law of fair use and they can go out and create consistent with the law. But as I looked out in the audience, the reaction of the audience was actually more like this to this. And that led me into a kind of moment of daydreaming, because there was something about this space that reminded me of my childhood, when I went to college. And I tried to think, what did this space evoke? And I realized when I was a kid, I traveled through the former Soviet republics, what are now former Soviet republics, and I realized this room was reminding me of this space. And then I began to think, well, when was it in the history of the Soviet system that you could have convinced members of the Soviet system that their system had failed? 1976 was way too early. It was puttering along. They couldn't have convinced anybody then. 1989 was too late. If they didn't get it by 1989, they never were going to get it. So when was it between 76 and 1989 that you could have convinced one of them that this system was never going to work? And what could you have said to them to convince them that this romantic ideal which they grew up with had crashed and burned and they needed to think about a radically new system? That to continue with the Soviet system was to betray a certain kind of insanity. Because as I listen to us lawyers, especially us lawyers here in the United States, insist nothing has changed. The same rules apply. It's the pirates who are the deviants. Well, that might be true, but the pirates who need to be reformed. I recognize that it is we who are insane here. That this existing system, this existing architecture could never work in this digital environment. Either we're going to force our kids to stop creating, or we're going to force a revolution on this system. And both options, in my view, are just not acceptable. We lawyers need to recognize there is an abolitionist movement out there. Abolitionists who believe copyright should end, that it was a good idea for the 20th century and a good idea for the 19th century, but it should not be our future. I am against abolitionism. In this way, I feel more like Gorbachev than like Yeltsin, right? I'm an old communist just trying to make the system function in a new world. We need to preserve copyright against these extremisms, because if we participate in the extremisms, we will encourage the very fight that will destroy the system. Now, there are many who don't care about protecting the system. There are many who don't care about whether copyright is part of American law in the 21st century. Let me end then with something that whether you believe you care or not, all of us should care about. We think about the potential of this architecture for creativity. We need to recognize that we cannot kill this creativity. We can only criminalize it. We can't stop our kids from creating in ways that at least I never imagined creating when I was growing up. We can only drive their creativity underground. We're not going to make them passive. We can only make them, quote, pirates. And the question we need to ask is whether that is any good. Our kids grow up in this age of prohibitions here in the United States, constantly living their life against the law. And that life against the law is corrosive and corrupting of the rule of law in a democracy. And what's necessary is that we, who know the most about how this system can work, and the ideals and principles that make it make sense, we must lead this battle out of this failed and endless struggle that it seems stuck in now. And I fling myself across the country to come into the den of the lions to plead with you that you join in this movement now to change this debate. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions if you'd like. Yes, sir.
You dealt almost exclusively with the artistic domain.